When a painter wants to create a painting, they of course have their own mediums to do so. Paints of different colors allow them to make their creation. A woodworker has a palette too. In this case, it's wood species as opposed to pigments and dyes of paint, but you do still get some of the same effects. You can have the light of a maple compared with the dark of a wenge or a Peruvian walnut. You can get the colors that come out of something like a orange to red Paduke, or maybe something purple like this Purple Heart. You can get more varieties of natural tones all blended together like this zebra wood, or the yellows and reds that come out of this canary wood. And when those options aren't enough, if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I also sometimes experiment with using epoxies that have the traditional pigments, something like you might see inside of a paint. Well, I have been asked to put together this particular scene right here. It's for a project that I'm helping with in a barn upgrade and remodel. And the challenge for me today is to figure out how to take my palette and turn it into something that represents the art that's done here. The traditional way of creating an artistic piece like that, or maybe a complicated pattern where you're putting different species together with small pieces, is to take a veneer strip like these two here, to trace out what pattern you want on it, to cut that by hand and then glue the pieces together. That's how inlay was done for hundreds of years. It does have a few drawbacks, of course. One is that this is thin material, and if ever your top coat that is trying to protect it wears away, it's quite easy to wear through this as well. The other drawback is that when you want to work with epoxies, like I often do, this thickness just isn't enough to support what the epoxy has to offer. But it is much more difficult to work with thicker wood to get it cut to these precise measurements that you want so that you can fit it together like a puzzle. And that's where this particular tool comes into play. An 80-watt laser has the ability to cut through 1/4 inch material of all sorts of different species of wood, no matter how light or dense they might happen to be. And it allows you to essentially duplicate the hand cutting that you could do on this thin veneer with precise cuts that will fit the pieces of the puzzle together. And the pieces of this particular puzzle need to go onto this board right here, which I'll prepare for the purpose in a bit. But that is my challenge today, to get those materials together, to recreate that artistic work that's been done, and get it integrated into this piece so that it can go into the barn. There were a number of artistic and technical challenges to iron out before working on the whole big piece, and it makes sense to do little prototypes in the beginning. But first I had to discuss it with the designer for the whole barn project. So we went over each one of the colors that is in this particular drawing, and we assigned out some of the woods we thought would match best. There were some still open questions though. We thought this barn in here has a red color that we want to match with the actual barn itself. Would Paduke be enough? It's a little more of an orange color, or should that be epoxy? The sheep, should it be a light maple, or should it be a white epoxy with wooden backgrounds? We made some of those choices based on the palettes of the pieces of wood that I already had, but some of them were still open questions, so that's why I made these over here. We have both wooden and epoxy versions of both the sheep and the barn, and the top ones show the full wooden inlay, and the bottom ones show the epoxy. In some cases, the questions are still out there. I think the red epoxy may have come in a little more dark, and I need to experiment with some new pigments. But it's a good starting point, and it did allow me to dial in the settings on the laser that work just perfectly to compensate for the thickness of the laser cut itself, the kerf of the laser as it goes through the material. I found that adding 0.05 of a millimeter to each one of the cuts makes it so they fit just snugly together in my particular case. But with these here, I have some confidence to move forward with the pieces that I know I want. So I'm going to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and then we'll see if we like the way that turns out. Masking off the wood pieces that you put into the laser isn't required when you're going to be doing a lot of sanding on the front. but I've just found it a good habit to be in when cutting wood in a laser cutter. I'm cutting the pieces out in my new X-Tool P3 laser cutter. This laser has twice the power of my previous laser cutter, which means that I'm able to switch between dense woods and light woods without any problems. While the upside to using masking tape is that you get nice clean edges, the downside of course is that you have to peel it all off in the end. For several hours I just went back and forth. I'd find the piece of wood that I thought best matched what I was trying to replicate in the picture. Then I would take it over to the laser cutter to be cut out. Then I would try to dry fit all the pieces together, just laying them on top of the board that they would eventually go into. Then it was back to the laser cutter, and back again to the dry fit. The whole process is actually quite a bit of fun, and as a side benefit, it makes your shop smell pretty good too. The reason you really want to do that dry fit first is not just to make sure that everything fits together properly. It also gives you that chance to just step back and say, is everything coming together the way that I wanted it to? And in the case of this barn, it kind of wasn't. The designer and I had both selected hickory as the background for the sky to just kind of make it match the rest of the tabletop. But we both felt that that just wasn't working. So I went and grabbed a piece of poplar that had a grain pattern and coloration that I kind of liked, and I cut out some replacement pieces for the hickory. Putting those new replacement pieces in really did the trick. With the lighter pieces at the bottom and the darker pieces towards the top, it gave this impression of a sunrise coming up behind the barn, and it looked great. The inlay looks great, and the designer agrees, so we're going to go ahead now and try and assemble it all together. In order to do that, of course, I need to cut a pocket out of this piece of the table that's about 1/4 inch deep so it can accommodate all of the little pieces, which are also about 1/4 inch. To do that, I'm going to use the shaper, which means that I can just send the shape in and tell it to guide me around and get the exact shape that I want. Now that isn't necessary if you want to do something like this. These are straight line cuts here. It would be just as easy to take a little piece, find out where that straight line is going to be, take a little piece of wood across that line and use a flush trim bit to get the outline and then just pocket out the rest by hand. But the Shaper Origin does have another benefit, and that is that it will sense exactly where the top of the surface is and then let you dial in what the depth of the cut's going to be. So I'm going to make this cut just a little bit less than 1/4 inch so that it's sticking up a little when I glue it all together and I can sand it down flat and get everything nice and even. The Shaper Origin works like a mini CNC machine that you guide by your own hand. It keeps track of its position by looking ahead for these domino images. So I needed to put some both on the piece itself and in front of it. This is a really big pocket, so I needed to add an extension to the base as well. This extension is something I make myself. If you also have a Shaper Origin and you're interested in one of these extensions, just go check out my Etsy store. A little sanding cleaned it all up so that it would have a nice flat surface to glue to. As you can see, I've got it all put back together again and is now properly inset into the piece that's going to go into the tabletop. Now you might be wondering what's going on with these clamps and everything around it. Let me explain. The piece is made of 2 pieces glued together, and when I glued them together they were pretty flat. But after a couple of days I noticed a little tiny cup to them. Well, when I took the surface area off the top, I'm taking between 1/4 and 1/3 of the surface area off the top, so whatever tension it was holding back with that surface area made it so that the cup got so much worse. So right now I've clamped it down to my table to straighten it out once again, and I want it to be straight when I do this glue down. If it continues to be a problem, I may have to cut some little grooves in the back to kind of persuade it back to being flat. Nobody's going to see the back. These are little spacers because the border that I cut around actually was designed to be black. Just a little tiny sliver of a black border going all around. I'm going to do that in black epoxy once I've got this all set up and firmed up. These are just little spacers to make sure that I put the pieces in the right spot so that we have an even border all the way around. And if you have a keen eye, you may have noticed that I'm missing a couple of pieces in here. I think I might have vacuumed them up just on accident. So I'll have to go cut those out again before I get the glue up going. I did promise to share a trick with you when it comes to glue ups of this nature. Now I can take a 99-cent clamp like this, obviously, and get the ends to hold down tight. But what about the middle? You want to be working with wood glue, but wood glue doesn't set up super fast. It wants something to hold it in place while it's drying. And it turns out that you can do a combination of wood glue and CA glue to get that effect. Essentially what you do is you take the CA glue, which is not quite as strong when it comes to wood, and you put it in just a few strategic places, and it will set up quickly, hold that piece together while you have the majority of it being held with the wood glue. This will hold it long enough for that to set up, and you'll get the strength out of the wood glue. I'll show you how that works in just a second, and we'll get this all put together. The key to this little glue up trick is that you cannot mix the wood glue and the CA glue, the super glue. If you do, then the water that's inside of the wood glue will act as an accelerant on the CA glue. This will most likely cause your CA glue to set up before you've even put it into place. That just means that as you're putting on the wood glue, which you do first, just leave a few spaces out there so you can strategically add the CA glue and allow it to give you a fairly even clamping pressure as the other glue sets up. The real accelerant should be sprayed onto the wood backing. Just be sure that the pieces you're working on are out of the way when you do so. It's pretty easy to get some overspray onto your CA glue, and you really don't want that. Now inevitably, you're still going to have a few gaps in between your inlay pieces. The best way that I've found to fix this is to first unplug your sander from its vacuum. For this kind of sanding, you're going to want to keep the dust that's generated from the sanding. Take your wood glue and spread it across the joints between the inlaid pieces, rubbing it inside of those joints with your finger and getting that top coat as smooth as possible. Then you can go across those joints that you've just added the glue to with your sander. The fine dust that's created will stick into those joints, and the glue will hold that in place, giving it a nice natural look. Just be sure to keep sanding until all of the glue on the surface is gone so that it doesn't ruin your finish later. The next step is for me to add that black epoxy border I spoke about earlier. Now I don't want that black epoxy to be soaking into the grain of the wood that's already there, so I'm actually going to start with a clear epoxy, which I paint around all of the borders. I'm not going to add the black epoxy until this clear epoxy is completely firmed up, which might take as much as 24 hours. With it all sealed up, the black epoxy can be just poured straight in. And I found I did have to wait a few minutes and do a second pour because it slowly seeped underneath the wood. Once the epoxy is in place, you again need to wait that 24 hours to let it settle up enough that it's safe to sand it. And once it was all sanded up nice and smooth, it was time to glue the whole tabletop together and apply the finish. And that is how a woodworker can apply his craft to become something of a painter too. I hope you enjoyed this process and maybe learned something along the way. If this is the kind of content that you find you enjoy watching, I'd encourage you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, or go back and watch some of the other builds that I've done. I'm just having fun making stuff, and I'm happy to have you along for the ride. I hope you'll join me for whatever it is I come up with next time. See you then.